But today I'm going to talk about an article that I alluded to a few days ago, and I really liked it because it struck a chord with something I've been saying for a very long time with regards to cultivation practices, best practices, integrated pest management, that kind of thing. Cool, excellent, good to hear it. So the article I was alluding to is called Whatever Happened to IPM, and it's by Robert K.D. Peterson, Leon G. Higley, and Larry P. Pedigo. And I have it right up here on my computer, which is right behind my phone here. And they go into, well, let me explain a little bit about IPM first, because it will give context to what I'm talking about. So, for those who aren't aware, or for those who just want to get a little refresher, integrated pest management is more than just like using biocontrols. Integrated pest management is the management of pests in an integrated system. So you use biocontrols, chemical controls, not necessarily systemic or synthesized chemicals, but chemicals nonetheless. In other words, non-living controls like a product like an oil or horticultural oil or a mineral oil or some sort of venom. There's some really interesting bio insecticides coming out that are like that. You could also use things like very, very basic fundamental preventative things that you might not have considered as like a control, but things in addition like what are called physical controls. So ways that you kill a pest physically that's non-chemical and non-biological. That could be something like smashing them between your fingers, or it can be like using a vacuum. This might sound ridiculous to you, but in big old fields, people will definitely use vacuums to vacuum up a bunch of pests, which is helpful when you're trying to make collections as like an entomologist, but also as a control. It absolutely works for certain organisms. And that's the other thing is that, well, there's also like mechanical controls and environmental controls, but you put them all together and you have an IPM system. But the same controls can work on multiple different pests at the same time, and they can also not work on other pests, and so you have to be aware of that sort of thing. You have to know about the physiology of what you're attacking, what you're going up against. And it's not going to be just one thing. That's the other thing, is that a truly competent IPM system will consider the whole gamut of what you're going to be controlling against. So the first thing you have to know is, what are they? What are those things that you're going to be going against? And then, what are your resources? And then, what are your options for attacking pests and preventing them? And hopefully you have both a preventative and a curative strategy when you do that. So I was gonna rant and rave about IPM, but I see that Green Gold Farms is asking me a question, and I'd be remiss if I didn't answer it. The question is, how is my day going? It's going great. That's why I'm doing this. And some weird bugs. Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we do that? I'm gonna go live with him right now. He's gonna show me some bugs, so we're gonna talk IPM.
So let me see if I can get this in the light. This is the only plant that has it too, but there's these black fucking, it's like a black bump on the plant, and these ants are farming them or something. Where are we at here? There you go.
Yeah, I bet that's a scale insect.
That's crazy, right? There you go.
Yeah. No, that looks like a black scale. That's exactly. It's probably producing honeydew. And the ants are going crazy. They're sucking up this sugar liquid that's coming from the plant. It looks like an armored scale, like a black scale.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy looking, right?
Yeah.
What's the best mode for them? Just scrape them off with a knife?
Yeah, absolutely. Just smash them with your fingers. It's really easy. If you only have a couple, you just squish them or take them off with your knife.
Yeah, I went through the whole garden trying to find them after I seen these, but this is just some random shit that popped up, and it's like not in a big box or anything. Look how big this fucking thing is.
Yeah, Sometimes they just come out of nowhere, and they're pretty incidental, I find. But they'll feed on.
Got our garden looking great. I employed a friend of mine to take over. I just straight up did not have the time, and fuck it, I can admit it. But we're not doing clones anymore, so we're just gonna let the flowers come, you know.
Mm.
But it's huge now, dude. Remember when you come over and look at it and it was little, and now it's like...
It's only been like a few weeks, right?
Right, dude. It just took off. Like Skywalker earned its name, because that's an 8-foot post right next to it, and it just started just went into. I just flipped the lights off, so it's gonna get quite a bit more. Joking about it being 10-foot nugs.
May very well be. Well, cool. I'm glad that I was able to figure that out pretty quickly then.
Yeah, it's actually looking really nice over here. Hold on, let me clean that down. Yeah. It's actually looking really nice over here. I got these green crack on the back porch. Not a single nothing on them. I mean, they are doing great. And then I got a whole room back here of Skywalker. I'm going to sauce. This is all going to extract. I'm going to sauce a bunch. I'm going to try my hand at RSO with a lot of this. I want to make some RSO caps. You know how people like say this stuff tastes like ass? I didn't never know, because I never needed to eat any, and then I did, and I was like, man, why do people eat this? It tastes like shit. You know, it's like I had to put it in a brownie or something. I had to come up with an idea. So I'm gonna make some RSO caps. I'm like, boom, still tastes like shit. You just don't taste it. You know, like maybe an aftertaste.
Right. It's like I guess people are using it because they need it for medicine, right? But it's bitter medicine, so make it less bitter, right?
I remember when I was a kid, my grandma gave me castor oil one time, and it was, I didn't know what it was. She gave me a spoonful of it and told me to swallow it. Like my stomach was all upset, and I took a spoonful of it and I swallowed it, and I went, oh, what is that? And she goes, castor oil. And I turned around to the sink and I made myself throw up, and she goes, what the hell's wrong with you? And I was like, you just gave me motor oil. I thought it was like castor oil, motor oil. I was like, the fucking, I don't know what you did back in your day, but we don't eat motor oil. She thought it was the funniest thing ever.
It's like,
oh, it's busy today, man. Get all these CBD products out. You got to swing by and pick up a gift bag, bro.
Sounds like a good plan, man. I'll consider it payment for the Black Scale ID.
Awesome. Yeah, dude, I got all kind of stuff laying around. Come by and see me. Tinctures, topical salves, everything, bro. I'd love to hook you up.
For sure, man.
Well, I want to jump off here and let you go back to it. I just wanted to pop in because I seen some pests and you're good at that shit.
No, that was a really great, that was like, how do you put it? It was a good show and tell example. Anytime.
Right. Isn't that crazy how, like, they're like farming, like the ants are having, like, what do you call that? A symbiotic relationship with the black scale things, you know?
Yeah, they'll feed on the sugar, and then they'll protect the scale from other attackers, like parasitic wasps. And then also, like mealybugs, aphids, they all make honeydew, so it doesn't really matter if it's a scale or a mealybug. They'll help them all. It's not good for us.
Yeah,
anyway.
I had a farmer tell me a while back, and I didn't understand it way back then. I mean, I understood a long way, but he said, you know, if you got ants in the garden, that's the first sign that you got trouble. And I was like, ants don't do shit. And he's like, yeah, but they're a sign of the other things that are there. What you think the ants are eating? I'm like, oh, good call. They're not eating the weed. They're eating something.
Right. It's sort of an indirect problem, right?
Exactly. It's just a real telltale sign, you know. Well, hey, man, have a great one. I'm going to keep watching the live, but I've got some things I've got to do. So I appreciate you letting me go live with you and stuff, and I'll catch up with you. Hey, Callie Pade, that's the dude right there doing things in England. He knows his weed like you know your bugs. It's crazy.
Well, that's a good thing to know. So you know a lot more than I do.
Yeah, it's cool, dude. I'm telling you, bro, when people, like, talk to you or and stuff, man, you're like everybody's best friend, like, because it doesn't matter how big you are. It's like a doctor, right? It's like, it doesn't matter how big or how powerful or how whatever you are. Let the doctor tell you you've got an incurable disease, but maybe there's this one guy in Zimbabwe that can help you. You know what I mean? Like you're going to find that guy. Like, it's a problem that needs to be fixed, not that you want to fix.
Right.
So
I'm all about helping people. Little, big, doesn't matter to me. People need that support.
Absolutely, bro. Absolutely. Well, you keep on doing what you're doing, bro. You're way above my head, but it's cool to tap in. See you, buddy.
No problem, man. Yeah, so that's Thomas, and I did go to his place a little while ago, and that was actually very helpful as an example of why when you're doing controls you have to consider direct and indirect, and what are the insects coming in, and what are the worst pests, what are the most minor pests. Sometimes you get something you've never seen before, and you might be very worried because, as you should be, it could be something that's the next new big pest for you. And some places never have problems with some pests, and then other pests, it's a big problem. And so it becomes this issue of knowing what's a big issue that you should prioritize and what's not. And some things you'll find once and never again, or you'll only find them a few times, and they're not really worth putting up a big control plan for. Like a lot of leaf hoppers are like this, plant hoppers are like this. On some plants, and other plants they're a big problem. So it just really depends on what your crop is, what you're growing, what are your insects, what are your direct and indirect problems, what's their environment that they do well in, that kind of a thing. So that's IPM in general. Really quickly, it's just using integrated controls together for prevention and curative measures for pests. That's IPM. So in the article that I'm talking about, whatever happened to IPM, they make this, the three authors make this sort of statement about essentially, and if you want to know about it, I can send you this, a link. I'll put all this on YouTube, and then I'll link this to in the description for people to avail themselves of, because it's a really good concept. It's something I've been saying for a long time. It's really great to have other people sort of support it. So what they're talking about is why has sort of integrated pest management, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, you should really read the link for yourself, the article. I'm not going to go over everything. But they kind of talk about how IPM has, conceptually, it's sort of stagnated. And I think there's a number of reasons for it. One of the reasons for this, so somebody's mentioning about checking out the YouTube, so I should mention that the YouTube is called Zenthanol, Zenthanol, and I'll put links to that too in my story if you're interested in coming to my YouTube channel, subscribing, taking a look at the videos that I post about pests and pathogens and plant physiology and all kinds of stuff. Anyways, I'll go over that later, but all of these lives go onto YouTube as well. And if you're interested in helping me and supporting me and making me justifying the use of more content and more hours and putting up more videos, I've got a Patreon as well with the same name. So that would also be helpful for my video production efforts. But anyways, these guys, they talk about how IPM is sort of stagnated. And the reason why it's sort of stagnated is multifaceted. Like a lot of complex things in life, most things in life are complex, or the reasons for them are complex. So it's complex here. But I think that a really big part of it is that even professionals, by which I mean like a small-time organic farmer or a huge large-scale like agricultural production, industrial production system, at both scales, people don't use IPM, or rather, they might give it lip service as an integrated system, but they don't really. They don't necessarily do some of the fundamental things that are really important. Some of those fundamental things that are so important are things like crop scouting. My favorite topic to talk about. Anyone who's been watching these videos knows that I can't stop talking about crop scouting because it's such an important system, or it's such an important fundament of knowing what's going on in your crop. What was just illustrated here by Thomas is that you have to scout your crops, and not just incidentally. Don't just, if you're going into your plants and if you're taking down leaves or you're cutting branches, it's not just incidentally looking. It should be a regular thing that you do. And if you're like a commercial entity of any kind, if you're selling your product, your agricultural product, you should be making, and even if you're not, you can still do this. But you should definitely be making records, digital records specifically. You should have information from maybe a weekly perspective or a daily perspective, but that would get really egregious. But just having like an understanding of where you see your pests, if you saw them at all, how much sometimes is necessary, so that you have like what's called an economic injury level. And that's different for different crops. But essentially the idea is that if you go into your crops and you know that if you have 10% spider mite, that might be a point where in which you need to apply some sort of a control. Even if you're using preventative controls, it has now gotten to the point where you're heading towards a threshold where the yield might be too much for you, and you can't take the yield hit that the pest damage will incur on your crop, right? So that's why crop scouting is really important. But so many people, even on an industrial scale or any kind of commercial scale, they don't do that. And it's a really fundamental part of IPM. They might get like, oh, I'll use biocontrols, or I'll use chemicals, or I'll do whatever I'm going to do, but then they don't do anything else. They don't do the crop scouting, or they don't worry about it, or it's too much labor, or they make excuses, or they really can't afford it. I mean, that's legitimate, right? Sometimes you really can't afford something. So you do all this stuff. IPM has been around as a concept. It's been around for decades. A lot of people treat it like it's a really new thing, because for a lot of people it still kind of is, even though it's been around for a very long time. So that's why these people in this article made the point that they did, which is that it's not that there's been a lot of innovation, it's that there's been a lack of innovation. And personally, they didn't necessarily say this, but personally I feel like that's because of the stagnation of people adopting it. People just aren't adopting it at the level that they should be. But that's just my opinion. And they make some points. They talk about, I'll read you the paragraph that goes before the points. They say that in this brief paper, which is meant to generate further discussion in our profession, we discuss the critical roles ecology and evolution play in IPM, and then consider ways to reconnect them to and thereby improve IPM. Specifically, we recommend, and then here are the points. First point is initiating new dialogue and research on the central tenets of IPM, especially evolution. Really important thing. And not just evolution for pests, but also evolution for your plants, right? So what does that mean? That's genetic controls. That's engineering resistance in plants. That's maybe making your plants grow more natural defenses, improving its innate defense. Because plants, unlike humans, don't have what's called an adaptive immunity or adaptive immune system. They only have an innate immune system. They have immune system 1.0, and then humans and other organisms have an immune system 2.0, which is, I think, a good way to put it. So they have an immune system that really can only deal with what it's set to deal with. It doesn't have an ability to like adapt. Like it doesn't have like memory T cells or things like that like remember and do that sort of a thing. It's sort of limited, even though it's still very sophisticated. Don't get me wrong. Life, even in its fundamental levels, is extremely sophisticated. But still, like innate resistance is probably going to be the most important thing in the future for plants, because as a farmer, you don't have to buy products maybe as much, which will lower the costs. Maybe there'll be increased costs on the plants, but eventually that will democratize, one would think, just like technology. And you'll have in the beginning, how many people had micro-aerial vehicles or drones? Not many. But eventually, now you have people in a park who can use drones, and people are making whole commercial entities out of like the amateur drone scene and the professional drone scene. So it's the same kind of thing. Eventually, that technology will democratize, like all successful technologies try to, anyways. So that makes sense. Having sort of a directional difference with research, and specifically with evolution, with plants, but also with pests, and knowing that they can develop resistance, and not just with chemicals. A lot of people are aware that like specific chemistries for specific pests become resistant to those chemical agents, but biological agents can also be resisted, especially if you have a biological agent that the quality, for whatever reason, maybe the batch quality for like an entomopathogenic fungus or a nematode or something is not it's not maintained through breeding efforts. So you can end up with progeny that are less effective than their parents and ancestors were. Hopefully that makes sense. So you also have to consider that aspect as well. Biological controls shift and change depending on how we cultivate them, just like plants do, right? They also say that they also talk about replacing control with management. So I just talked about how you have chemical controls, environmental controls, biological controls, environmental controls, physical, mechanical controls. And that's like the tactician in me using terminology like that. And other people say this as well. It's not just me. But I think that maybe it's more intellectually honest, they're arguing, to say management over control. Because control implies that it's going to happen. But what does that mean? What is it? It's the control. It's the complete control. It's the perhaps eradication of that organism. And maybe you don't necessarily expect that that's going to happen. Maybe the pest is never going to be eradicated because the people to your left and right are not dealing with the pest, so it just keeps coming into your crop. So maybe management is a better word to use than control because of the implication and because of what it means for you in the grand scheme of ecology, right? If you're growing right next to a forest, or you're growing in a forest, or you're in Humboldt where there's oak trees and madrone and all these other kinds of plants, you have to understand that you are in the thick of things, and the organisms are going to come out from all directions, including the air. So you put all these things together, and you have to make that point, right? So there's also evolving from killing pests to managing host stress. So what does that mean? So let me say that again. Evolving from killing pests to managing host stress. So the emphasis is not on killing pests. The emphasis is not on control, like I said in the previous point. The emphasis is on actually just managing the host's ability to grow and the things that are going to demerit that. So what does that really mean? It means that, like I was saying before, if we focus on making the plants grow better and managing their ability to resist innately pests and pathogens, then you don't have to worry about control on your end. Your curative and preventative efforts are not necessary, or maybe not as necessary. I don't think that we will find a silver bullet, maybe even in my lifetime, to do that with. But in the great future, or perhaps if more research is put into agricultural efforts from a global standpoint, I mean, it is. I don't want anybody coming on and thinking that I don't appreciate that there are millions of dollars that go into this sort of information. But in my opinion, when you consider like global total budget and where things go in regard to all targets for money, for expenditures from a government standpoint, at least in the United States, not a whole lot of it goes into agriculture, or at least I feel like more should. But I'm biased, right? So, for example, let's say you had a plant that was infected with powdery mildew, or downy mildew, or whatever. And actually, it didn't really matter much because this plant has been bred in such a way that it will not have a really detrimental effect, and it can actually resist powdery mildew species that are known to infect it. Maybe even the powdery mildew doesn't even get to an infection point because it's got an innate resistance. So you don't even have to worry about fungicidal use at all. All you have to do is have the plant. And when you plant that plant does not get infected. And wouldn't that be amazing? You know, that would be the ultimate situation to be in. So if you, like, for example, take out the susceptibility genes in those plants that make them susceptible to powdery mildew, for example, then you will negate an extremely big pest for that crop. And powdery mildew is in a lot of different crops. So another example that we kind of already see is like aphids. I have definitely seen situations where farms or cannabis crops, for example, will, which can also be farms. I don't know why I said it like that, but I guess I'm trying to say that in general, plants can have like aphids, for example, and assuming that they don't carry or vector a virus, you know, the actual damage that they like create, unless they get into a huge population on a single plant, might not be that much. And you can, and especially if you're on annuals, you can kind of grow through that damage. But of course, optimally, you would never have them feeding on the plant because the more they suck down the phloem, the more sugar that they rob from the plant, and ultimately it means that the plant will grow less. The plant will yield less than it would normally. It'll have to stress out. It will have to prioritize defense mechanisms and things like this. So you put all of these things together, and you realize that yes, the yield loss will occur, but in some cases it won't really be a point. It won't be to a detrimental point that you will have a big economic injury level. It will be a non-zero number, but it won't be a big life-threatening number for the business. So managing host stress is important because if you turned all pest damage theoretically into low stress damage and you could just grow through it, that would be amazing. But, you know, that's kind of a pipe dream at this point. That's kind of a future thing that will require a lot of research and an understanding of plant physiology that we just don't have right now, right? But they talk about, so in the whole grand scheme, they talk about shifting the perspective from like absolute eradication control with IPM and the management of stress. And I think that's just an acknowledgement that you're always going to have pests, you're always going to have problems, and nobody's grow is going to be a perfect clean room for the vast majority of people. So you have to kind of, I guess you just kind of have to be accommodating to that, is kind of the point that they're making, in my opinion, as I read the article. And again, I want to reiterate that on my YouTube channel, people will be able to access the article, and you should do that. You should read it for yourself, and we can converse about what you thought about it, because I'd love to hear your guys' opinions. The next point they put is emphasizing how to use tactics and de-emphasize the focus on tactics themselves. Now, that's a thing that I, in the past, have been definitely weak to, because I'm the kind of person who likes to learn a bunch of different ways that people control a pest, and then you kind of piece together, and fundamentally this works pretty well for a lot of people. But fundamentally what you're doing is you're taking a bunch of different techniques from a bunch of different places. Like if you are a martial artist, like, you know, you learn a little bit of Jeet Kune Do, and you learn a little bit of Taekwondo and Tang Soo Do, and a little bit of Kung Fu or Gong Fu or whatever, and you put them all kind of together, and then you've kind of got this mixed martial artist who like can use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and capoeira and all these kinds of things, which is fine, and that works. It is helpful to know all these things. I'm not saying that collecting all these techniques for control is a bad thing. In fact, that's where I started, and you can still draw from that. And there's always new techniques coming out that are more sophisticated or low-tech because they're easier to do as a low-tech system, or they're more sophisticated and you might have to like pay for them, or you might have to, there might be a price to them, but they're still really good. And, you just have to have a balance with that. But here they're saying that we want to emphasize how to use those tactics and de-emphasize, like, I guess, your focus on them exactly. So a good example of that would be what I said in the beginning. Integrated pest management is the integration of different techniques of control. So in this case, managing stress, right? So it's the idea that you could take a bunch of different techniques, that's fine, but then you have to plan and you have to understand how they work in tandem, and you don't want things that will counteract each other or be to each other's detriment. So that's a really important aspect of integrated pest management. It's the techniques plus the actual integration effort, the actual planning. And it will be unique for every grow, right? Growing a plant in an indoor tent versus growing plants in a greenhouse or a glass house, or growing plants in an orchard, or growing plants in a giant field among other giant fields. It's all very different. And so your planning has to be unique to where you are geographically. What's your topography like? What are the pests you're going to interact with the most? What are the products that are available are? Are there any biologicals for the certain pests? What are the things on the horizon that you can expect to be able to utilize possibly? So all of those things come together, and that creates your plan. So it's not the techniques themselves, it's your integration therein. And then also you want to, I guess, utilize them in a way. Let me give you an example, I guess. This would be better. If you have, for example, a powdery mildew problem and you use biocontrols, let's say you're in a citrus orchard and you use Amblysia swarskyii to go after a whitefly. Okay. And you get a big powdery mildew problem because where you are, powdery mildew, it gets you in the winter because the weather patterns change, and you live in a place that's not like where I live, where they don't actually have weather, and it's all the same sort of climate for the entire year, to which I mean that there's never any rain. So let's say it starts to rain, and then you get fungus, you get powdery mildew on your leaves. Well, an easy control would be to use sulfur. But if you use that sulfur, sure, maybe it will kill the whitefly, and it will kill the fungus. But maybe, and I don't mean burning sulfur, I just mean micronized sulfur. But let's say you apply that, and then you kill your biologicals, because your biocontrol agents are arthropods. They're mites. So your Amblysia swarskyii will also be affected by the sulfur. So in your IPM plan, you have to either accommodate for that fact if you literally have no other options because maybe the sulfur is cheap and you can't afford a different product, or you don't want to use a systemic fungicide, or whatever other reason that there is, it will be unique to your grow. But you want to ideally have a plan that will bolster as many of the other techniques as possible and not be a detriment to them. But sometimes that's the only option you have. So you also don't want to gaslight yourself and make you think that you're a bad grower because a pest is difficult to deal with. Because a pest is almost always difficult to deal with, and it's going to be more difficult if you don't crop scout and you don't do preventative work. But generally speaking, sometimes things just go out of hand, and that's just life. Show me a person who's never had any problems with that, and I'll show you somebody who, maybe has a really, really, really perfect situation going, or maybe they're just lucky. Sometimes people go without having pests for a long time, and then suddenly they start getting big problems, and they think, oh, what did I do? What's wrong with me? Why am I doing so poorly? Well, did you change locations? That's a big factor. Did a different product, did products come off the shelf or become less available? And the climate changes too, and pests travel all the time. And we're getting more and more pests in newer locations because of climate change as well. So it's not you necessarily. Just because a pest comes to your location because it wants to eat some really great food that doesn't reflect on you. They'll find a way. They're pretty good at what they do. And then the last thing I have here is the last point that they make. They have bullet points. It's not the whole article, of course, but they say recommitting to and updating Kogan's levels of IPM adoption. And let me go over that because they also supplied that here on the article, I believe. Yeah, so Kogan's so here we have a table, which maybe I'll put in the video. Maybe I'll edit this video and put the table right here. But I'm going to read off of it instead. They have 3 levels of IPM management. And from Kogan's article in 1998. And here we have, so on the left side we have attributes. And the first one is agricultural scales. So on level 1 you have, like I was saying, host or field, so an individual plant or multiple plants. Level 2 is like multiple plants, hosts, or crop community. And then number 3 is agroecosystem, regional production system. So an entire operational area, which is huge, right? So we're talking like magnitudes of size. And that really matters. It really does matter. Some things are not scalable. Some things are scalable. And some things are scalable with a ton of money that would make it prohibitively expensive. And then, he kind of goes over socioeconomic scales and ecological scales, which is kind of what I just said. So you've got like individual populations, a community of multiple organisms, and then at the very end, a whole ecosystem, landscape, biosphere, or biome even, you could say. So on the level 1 focuses for IPM, you've got like in the very beginning, you've got level 1 management strategies for a complex of species or a single individual species. So like spider mites as a family, or just one individual kind of spider mite versus spider mite, white fly, broad mite, russet mite. Deer, maybe, if you have mammalian pests, rats, voles, although that's not really my speciality, but that kind of a thing. And then at level 2, you have that plus all of the other organisms. And I'm glad Thomas came online for that live, because that interaction between scale, insects, and ants is a really good example of like a level 2 IPM situation, sort of, where you've got scale insect that's doing direct damage to the plant. It's got a sucking mouthpart, and it sucks the phloem out of the plant, right? And then it makes babies, and then those babies go off and do the same thing to other parts of the plant. And then the ants come in, and they harvest honeydew from the scale insect, kind of like somebody would tap for sap from like a maple tree or something. That's how their body works, essentially. They're just a big old tap that goes right through their body, and then they produce honeydew at the end because of the pressure. It's like when you pierce it's like if you were to pierce a hose, the water will start to stream out. So it's at a very high pressure for them, and they have to like osmoregulate. But anyways, again, understanding the physiology of what you're trying to attack matters, because that will also inform you clever ways in which to deal with your organisms, or you might know how that interaction works. But then the ants come in and they protect the plant, or they protect the scale that's on the plant. So there's an interaction between the direct pest and an indirect pest. And there's other communities doing this. You have maybe an ant parasitoid that might normally keep out those ants, or might normally, really what's more likely is that will affect the general population of those pests. So you're maybe like year 2017 or 2014 or whatever, maybe you have no pests. And maybe the reason for that, or you have certain pests that aren't there. For an example, let's say it's a scale insect. Let's say they're mostly controlled because there's a large population of parasitoids in the local area. But you don't know this, but it's the fact of the matter. And then over the span of 3 years, maybe there's increased pesticide use, or the temperature changes rapidly, or the climate is different, or there are less parasitoids because of some other reason. And then suddenly you have a scale problem because, and then you have an ant problem, maybe, because the parasitoids for the scale aren't there to control the scale as much, and your location is where they happen to come into. And then you also have the ants. Maybe their parasitoids are also not functioning for the same reasons. So those two things happen. You're not aware of them, but now you have a scale problem and an ant problem like you didn't have before. And that's not your fault. That's just life changing all the time. So you always have to be aware of that sort of a thing. That does make sense, I hope. And then at the level 3, you've got what they put here is management of pests and host stress within and across production systems. So that's kind of what I was describing at the very end. From like an ecosystem standpoint, you have all these little inputs happening all at once that you're not privy to. You only see the small microcosm that exists in your cultivation space, but that's not necessarily what's going on in general. I mean, it can't be, right? Because your ecosystem is cultivated and it's cleared in such a way that you want it to be controlled. So it's not the wild, but it's your controlled microcosm. And those organisms from the wild can come in, and then you have those problems with pests, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. I didn't want to take up maybe the whole time, although I don't really have a timer, so I really don't know how long I've been rambling on for. But there's also a nice figure on this article that I'm going to also talk at you about. It's an arrow. So on the left side of the arrow, we have what we were doing, and on the right side of the arrow is what these 3 authors are saying we should kind of move towards. And it's something that I've also agreed with quite a bit. Despite my use of terminology and differences there, I generally agree that fundamentally we're talking about host stress. Fundamentally, we're talking about plants and their ability to yield and their inability to yield due to pests and pathogens and things like that. So if you find a way, if you could magically find a way to have a plant that yields production like enough, and even if it was attacked by a lot of pests, you would have the perfect plant for production. That doesn't really exist right now, but you can kind of see how that could work with like aphids. A lot of aphids that don't vector viruses, for example, they don't feed, I mean, unless your population is massive, like that scale. Imagine if plants could deal with most pests like they deal with those steronichids, or the steronica, which just suck up phloem. And imagine if the plant was more or less able to yield quite a bit despite that fact. But on the left here, you know, using words like control, killing pests, tactics, breeding, say breeding for antibiosis or antizoonosis, essentially breeding for not having life and not having foreign things coming in, which is kind of what I've been talking about. And then moving from that to management of host stress, how to use those tactics effectively, and then breeding for tolerance. So resistance maybe is not always going to be possible, but tolerance might actually be possible. I don't know how necessarily in the granular, in the detail. I do know that there are genes that would help with that. There are gene families in plants that conserve their innate immunity, their immune response, the use of different compounds, like terpenes, for example, that sort of a thing. But plants, you know, their entire genome is going to be complex. And sometimes when you have one thing sometimes when you prioritize one trait, then other traits are deprioritized, or they're linked, or they're not linked, and so you get a problem with that down the line. So anyways, that's what I want to talk about. This video is going to be on my YouTube channel. You can check it out. It's called Zenthanol, Zenthanol. If that's a little too hard, I'm going to have links and stuff in my story, so check it out. And I'm going to also link this article in the YouTube description so that you can take a look at it, because I think it's a really cool article. I really agree with a lot of its points, and I'm really happy to see other people say some of the same things that I've been saying for quite a long time. And that's all I had to say. Have a good one.